The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III sat at his mahogany desk, staring at the letter before him. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he picked up his fountain pen. At 75, he had faced many difficult moments in his life, but this one felt different. This was about his son Harry, and the words he was about to write would change their relationship forever. Charles had been king for just over 2 years now, and the weight of the crown had taught him harsh lessons about duty versus family love. Every decision he made was watched by millions around the world. Every word he spoke was analyzed and debated. But this letter was perhaps the most personal and painful thing he would ever have to do as both a king and a father. The palace corridors were unusually quiet that Tuesday morning in October. The staff moved about their duties with hushed voices, sensing that something important was happening. Even the usually chattering kitchen staff spoke in whispers as they prepared the morning tea service. Everyone knew that the relationship between the king and Prince Harry had been strained for years, but nobody quite understood how deep the wounds had become. In his private study, Charles thought back to happier times when Harry was just a little boy with wild red hair and mischievous eyes. He remembered teaching Harry to fish at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, watching him laugh as he struggled with the fishing rod. Those summer days felt like a lifetime ago now. Harry had been such a joyful child, always ready with a smile and a hug for his father. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The death of Harry's mother, Princess Diana, in 1997 had left scars on both father and son that never properly healed. Charles knew he hadn't been the perfect father during those dark months after Diana's funeral. He had been dealing with his own grief and guilt, trying to hold together a monarchy that was under intense public scrutiny. Harry's rebellious teenage years had been splashed across newspaper headlines around the world. The young prince's struggles with alcohol, his wild parties, and his anger toward the media had worried Charles deeply. But, through it all, Charles had hoped that Harry would eventually find his way back to the family and his royal duties. For a while, it seemed like Harry had found his path. His military service in Afghanistan had given him purpose and direction. His charity work with wounded veterans had shown the world a more mature and compassionate side of the prince. Charles had been proud watching Harry grow into a man who seemed to understand the weight of his royal birthright. The turning point came when Harry met Meghan Markle, an American actress with her own strong opinions about life and fame. Charles had initially welcomed Meghan into the family, hoping she would bring happiness to his troubled son. At their wedding in 2018, Charles had walked Meghan down the aisle when her own father couldn't attend. He had felt genuine joy seeing Harry so happy and in love. But the fairy tale didn't last long. Within months of the wedding, stories began emerging about tensions behind palace walls. Meghan struggled with the rigid protocols of royal life. She found it difficult to accept that her every move would be controlled by palace officials, her every word carefully managed by communications teams. She had been used to speaking her mind freely in Hollywood, and the constraints of royal life felt like a prison to her. Harry, caught between his love for his wife and his loyalty to his family, began to change. The carefree prince who had once charmed the public with his easy smile became increasingly defensive and angry. He started to see every criticism of Meghan as a personal attack, every negative news story as evidence of a conspiracy against them. Charles tried to reach out to his son during those difficult months. He invited Harry and Meghan to private dinners, hoping to find common ground and work through their problems as a family. But the conversations often ended in arguments, with Harry accusing his father of not protecting Meghan from media attacks, and Charles trying to explain the realities of royal life that couldn't simply be changed overnight. The situation grew worse when Harry and Meghan announced their decision to step back from their senior royal roles in January 2020. They wanted to become financially independent while still representing the Queen. Charles felt blindsided by the announcement, which came without any private discussion with the family first. The public nature of their declaration felt like a betrayal to the king, who had always believed that family matters should be handled privately. The negotiations that followed were painful for everyone involved. Charles found himself caught between his roles as a father who wanted to support his son and as a future king who had to protect the institution of the monarchy. The final agreement allowed Harry and Meghan to step away from royal duties but required them to give up their royal titles and stop using them for commercial purposes. Charles had hoped that the separation would give everyone time to heal and perhaps find a way back to each other. Instead, the distance seemed to make things worse. Harry and Meghan moved to California, and their communications with the royal family became increasingly rare and strained. The breaking point came in March 2021 with their interview with Oprah Winfrey. Charles watched the broadcast from his study at Highgrove House, his heart breaking with every accusation his son made. Harry spoke about feeling trapped by his royal life, about conversations within the family regarding the skin color of his unborn child, about feeling abandoned by his father during their darkest moments. But what hurt Charles the most was Harry's claim that his father had stopped taking his phone calls. Charles knew the truth was more complicated than that. He had tried many times to reach out to Harry, only to have their conversations end in arguments about money, security, and Meghan's treatment by the British media. Eventually, the calls had become so painful that both father and son had simply stopped trying. The Oprah interview had damaged the monarchy's reputation around the world. Charles knew that as the future king, he needed to respond, but, as a father, he wanted to protect his relationship with Harry. The palace's measured response, recollections may vary, had been carefully crafted to avoid escalating the conflict while also defending the institution. But, privately, Charles was devastated. Friends and palace staff noticed that he seemed to age years in the weeks following the interview. His usually impeccable posture sagged slightly, and his eyes held a sadness that hadn't been there before. The man who had waited his entire life to be king was learning that the crown came with costs he had never fully anticipated. Over the following months, Charles continued to reach out to Harry through intermediaries and occasional text messages. He never stopped hoping that they could find a way back to each other. When Harry returned to London for Prince Philip's funeral in April 2021, Charles felt a flicker of hope seeing his son again. But their brief conversations were formal and cold, nothing like the warm relationship they had once shared. Harry's memoir, announced in the summer of 2021, had been another blow. Charles knew that his son was writing a book about his life, and he feared what revelations it might contain. The very idea that Harry would share private family moments and conversations with the world felt like another betrayal to the king. As 2022 progressed and Charles officially became king following Queen Elizabeth's death, he had to make increasingly difficult decisions about Harry's role in the family. The coronation in May 2023 had been particularly painful. Harry had attended alone, sitting in the third row, far from the core royal family. The symbolism had been clear to everyone watching. Harry was no longer considered a working member of the royal family. Now, sitting at his desk on this quiet October morning in 2024, Charles knew he had reached a point where he could no longer avoid making a definitive statement about Harry's future. The constant speculation in the media about a possible reconciliation was becoming a distraction from his work as king. More importantly, the uncertainty was preventing both him and Harry from moving forward with their lives. The letter he was about to write would be shared with a select group of senior palace officials and would form the basis of an official statement. It would make clear that while Harry would always be his son and would always be loved, there would be no return to royal duties or official role within the monarchy. The decision wasn't made in anger or spite, but from a place of sad acceptance that some relationships simply cannot be repaired. Charles looked out the window at the palace gardens where he had once played with his young sons. Those memories felt both precious and painful now. He picked up his pen again and began to write, knowing that each word would be scrutinized and debated for years to come. But, more than that, he knew that these words would likely be the final chapter in the relationship between a father and son who had loved each other deeply but could no longer find their way back to each other. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows as King Charles III wrote what may have been the most difficult letter of his life. Outside, London went about its daily business, unaware that history was being written in the quiet study of Buckingham Palace. The letter would soon change everything, not just for the royal family, but for millions of people around the world who had followed this painful family drama with fascination and heartbreak. As he finished the first paragraph, Charles paused and thought about Harry as a little boy, running through these same palace halls with his brother William, both boys laughing and carefree. He wondered if Harry ever thought about those days too, and whether somewhere in his heart, his son missed the family they used to be as much as Charles did. But there was no going back now. The words on the paper before him would ensure that. King Charles III was about to send a message that would echo through history, a message that would make clear once and for all where Prince Harry stood in the future of the British monarchy. And, for a father who had always hoped for reconciliation, writing those words felt like saying goodbye to his son all over again. The palace staff continued their quiet work in the corridors outside, unaware that in a few hours, their world would change once again. The relationship between King Charles and Prince Harry had reached its final chapter, and nothing would ever be the same again. 3,000 miles away in Montecito, California, Prince Harry was sitting in his home office, unaware that his father was writing a letter that would change his life forever. The morning California sun filtered through the windows of his modern house, so different from the ancient stones of the palaces where he had grown up. Harry was reviewing security arrangements for an upcoming charity event, one of the many causes he had taken on since leaving royal life behind. At 39, Harry had built a new life in America with his wife Meghan and their two young children, Archie and Lilibet. Their house was filled with the sounds of family life, children's laughter, Meghan's voice calling from the kitchen, the dogs barking in the garden. It was the kind of normal family life he had always dreamed of but never thought possible when he was a working royal. But, despite the peaceful exterior, Harry carried a heavy burden of sadness about his relationship with his family back in England. Not a day went past without him thinking about his father, his brother William, and the life he had left behind. The decision to step away from royal duties had been the hardest choice he had ever made, but he had felt he had no other option to protect his wife and children. Harry's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his private secretary calling from London with updates about his ongoing legal cases against several British newspapers. For years, Harry had been fighting in court against what he saw as unfair and intrusive coverage of his family. The legal battles were expensive and emotionally draining, but he felt they were necessary to protect his privacy and that of his children. The conversation reminded Harry of all the reasons why he had felt compelled to leave royal life. The constant media attention, the feeling that his every move was being watched and judged, the inability to protect his wife from what he saw as racist and sexist coverage. He had watched his mother Diana struggle with the same pressures, and he was determined not to let history repeat itself with Meghan. After finishing the call, Harry walked through his house, looking at the photos on the walls. There were pictures of him and Meghan on their wedding day, photos of their children taking their first steps, images from their various charity work. But, mixed in with these happy moments were older photos from his life in England, pictures with his father at polo matches, images of him and William as children, photos from his military service. These older photos always brought mixed emotions. Harry felt proud of his military service and the work he had done with wounded veterans. He had genuine love for the British people and the country where he had grown up. But he also felt anger and frustration about how his family had handled the situation with Meghan, and sadness about how far apart he and his father had grown. The relationship with his father had been complicated long before Meghan entered the picture. Harry had always felt that Charles struggled to connect with his sons emotionally after Diana's death. Where Diana had been warm and openly affectionate, Charles was more reserved and formal. Harry understood that his father had his own difficult childhood and way of showing love, but, as a young man grieving his mother, he had needed more emotional support than Charles seemed able to give. Harry remembered the years after his mother's death as the darkest period of his life. He had acted out in ways that embarrassed the royal family and worried his father deeply. The drinking, the wild parties, the angry confrontations with photographers, all of it had been his way of dealing with pain and grief that he didn't know how to express in healthier ways. His military service had saved him in many ways. In the army, Harry had found purpose and brothers in arms who accepted him for who he was rather than his royal title. His 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan had shown him a world beyond the privileged bubble of royal life, and had given him a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with his birthright. When he returned from military service, Harry had thrown himself into charity work, particularly with wounded veterans and mental health causes. He had been genuinely happy during those years, feeling like he was finally using his royal position for meaningful purposes. His father had been proud of him during this period, and their relationship had seemed to be healing. Everything changed when he met Meghan. From their very first date, Harry had felt a connection unlike anything he had experienced before. Meghan was intelligent, accomplished, and passionate about social justice issues that Harry cared deeply about. She challenged him intellectually and encouraged him to think about his role in the world in new ways. But Harry had also been immediately concerned about how Meghan would handle the intense scrutiny that came with dating a royal. He had seen how the media treated his previous girlfriends, and he knew that as an American actress, Meghan would face even more intense coverage. His fears proved to be well-founded when their relationship became public and Meghan was subjected to a level of media attention that felt overwhelming even by royal standards. Harry had begged his father and the palace communications team to do more to protect Meghan from what he saw as unfair and often racist coverage. But the palace's approach had always been to avoid engaging with negative stories, believing that responding only gave them more attention. This strategy had worked for generations of royals, but Harry felt it was inadequate for the modern media landscape and the unique challenges Meghan faced as a biracial American woman. The wedding in May 2018 had been a high point in their relationship with the royal family. Harry had felt genuinely happy seeing how his father had stepped in to walk Meghan down the aisle when her own father couldn't attend. Charles had seemed to genuinely welcome Meghan into the family, and, for a brief moment, Harry had hoped that everything would work out. But the honeymoon period didn't last long. Within months of the wedding, tensions began to emerge. Meghan struggled with the rigid protocols of royal life and felt isolated and unsupported within the institution. Harry watched his wife, who had been confident and successful in her previous life, become increasingly unhappy and withdrawn. The situation was made worse by constant negative stories in the British tabloids. Harry felt that Meghan was being treated unfairly compared to other royal family members, and he was frustrated by what he saw as the palace's unwillingness to defend her. Several times, he had heated conversations with his father about the need for more protection and support, but Charles had maintained that the royal family's approach to media coverage had worked for decades and shouldn't be changed. Harry's relationship with his brother William also began to deteriorate during this period. William had expressed concerns about the speed of Harry's relationship with Meghan, suggesting that Harry should take more time before getting serious. Harry had interpreted this as William not accepting Meghan, while William had felt he was just looking out for his younger brother. The breaking point came when Harry and Meghan decided they needed to step away from their senior royal roles. Harry had spent months trying to find a compromise that would allow them to continue some royal duties while also having more control over their lives and privacy. But the palace had been unwilling to create what they saw as a half-in, half-out model of royal service. Harry felt that the family's response to their announcement had been cold and bureaucratic rather than understanding and supportive. The negotiations about their future had felt more like business discussions than family conversations. Harry had hoped his father would be more sympathetic to their situation, but Charles had seemed more concerned about protecting the monarchy than supporting his son. The move to California had been both liberating and heartbreaking for Harry. He loved the freedom and privacy that his new life offered, and he was grateful for the opportunity to build a normal family life with Meghan and their children. But he also missed his homeland and felt deep sadness about the estrangement from his family. The Oprah interview had been Harry's attempt to tell his side of the story and explain why they had felt compelled to leave royal life. He had hoped that speaking publicly about their struggles would help people understand their decision and perhaps even open the door to reconciliation with his family. Instead, the interview had seemed to make the rift even wider. Harry knew that some of his comments during the interview had been hurtful to his family, particularly his father. But he also felt that he had been pushed to that point by years of feeling unsupported and misunderstood. He had tried many times to have private conversations with his father about their problems, but those discussions had often ended in arguments or misunderstandings. The birth of his daughter Lilibet in June 2021 had been a moment of pure joy for Harry, but it was tinged with sadness that she would grow up not knowing her grandfather and uncle the way Archie had briefly known them. Harry had named his daughter after Queen Elizabeth as a gesture of respect and love for his grandmother, but he worried that his children would miss out on the rich family history and traditions that had been such an important part of his own childhood. Harry had returned to England only a handful of times since moving to California, and each visit had been emotionally difficult. The funeral of his grandfather Prince Philip in April 2021 had been particularly hard. Harry had wanted to support his grandmother during her grief, but the formal atmosphere and limited interactions with his family had reminded him of how much distance had grown between them. His brief return for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in June 2022 had been another painful reminder of his changed status. He and Meghan had attended some events but were clearly no longer part of the core royal family. The symbolism had been obvious to everyone watching, and Harry had felt like a guest at events where he had once been a central figure. The Queen's death in September 2022 had been devastating for Harry. Despite all the family tensions, he had maintained a close relationship with his grandmother throughout his life. She had been a constant source of support and love, even when other family relationships were strained. Her death had made Harry realize how much time might be running out to repair his relationship with his father. Harry had hoped that his father's coronation might provide an opportunity for reconciliation, but the event had only highlighted how far apart they had grown. Attending alone while Meghan stayed in California with their children, sitting far from the main royal family, Harry had felt like an outsider at his own father's most important moment. Now, sitting in his California home on this October morning, Harry was trying to focus on his current projects and the life he was building with his family. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening back in England. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and something told him that this day would be different from all the others. His phone buzzed with a text message from a friend in London, asking if he had heard any news from the palace. Harry replied that he hadn't, but the message left him feeling uneasy. In a few hours, he would learn that his father had written a letter that would change everything between them. But, for now, he sat in the California sunshine, unaware that thousands of miles away, King Charles was putting the final touches on words that would end any hope of Harry's return to royal life. The irony wasn't lost on Harry that while he was trying to build a new life away from royal duties, he was still defined by his relationship to the monarchy. Every interview, every public appearance, every business venture was analyzed through the lens of his royal background. He wondered if he would ever truly be free of the institution he had been born into, or if the weight of his royal heritage would follow him for the rest of his life. As he prepared for another day in his new American life, Harry had no idea that his father was about to make that question irrelevant. The letter being written in Buckingham Palace would ensure that there would be no more speculation about Harry's future role in the monarchy. King Charles was about to close the door permanently, and neither father nor son would ever be the same again. The letter was finished. King Charles III set down his fountain pen and read through the words he had just written for the third time. Each reading made the finality of his decision feel more real and more painful. The formal language couldn't hide the emotional weight of what he was announcing to the world. His son Harry would never return to royal duties, and their relationship as they had known it was officially over. Charles's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, knocked softly on the study door before entering. The king's most trusted advisor had been expecting this moment for months. He had watched Charles struggle with the decision about Harry's future, seeing the toll it took on the monarch both personally and professionally. Clive had been with Charles through many difficult moments, but he had never seen his boss look quite so aged and defeated as he did now. "Your Majesty, the letter is ready for review?" Clive asked quietly, approaching the desk with the careful respect that came from decades of royal service. Charles nodded, sliding the handwritten pages across the mahogany surface. "Read it carefully, Clive. Once we release this statement, there will be no going back. Harry will know exactly where he stands, and so will the world." As Clive read the letter, Charles stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. He could see tourists gathering outside the gates, many of them probably hoping for a glimpse of royalty. How many of them had followed the Harry and Meghan saga with fascination? How many had taken sides in this very public family dispute? Soon they would all have their answer about Harry's future. The letter was carefully worded, as all official royal communications were. It expressed the king's love for his son while making it clear that Harry had chosen a path incompatible with royal service. It acknowledged Harry's contributions to various causes while emphasizing that future charitable work would be entirely separate from the monarchy. Most importantly, it stated definitively that there would be no return to official royal duties for Prince Harry. But, beneath the formal language, Charles had tried to include subtle messages that only Harry would understand. References to their shared love of environmental causes, mentions of Harry's military service that had made Charles so proud, gentle acknowledgments of the happy memories they had shared. Charles hoped that somewhere in the official statement, Harry would find traces of the father who still loved him despite everything that had happened. Clive finished reading and looked up at the king with concern. "Your Majesty, this will generate enormous media attention. Are you prepared for the response this will receive?" Charles turned from the window, his face showing every one of his 75 years. "I've been preparing for this for 3 years, Clive. Every attempt at private reconciliation has failed. Every olive branch has been rejected or ignored. The uncertainty is damaging both the monarchy and Harry himself. It's time for clarity, even if it's painful." The king's voice was steady, but Clive could see the deep sadness in his eyes. Charles had always been a devoted father, despite his formal upbringing and the demands of royal life. Watching him make this final decision about Harry felt like witnessing a parent give up on a beloved child, even though Clive knew the king felt he had no choice. "Shall I begin the process of preparing the official statement for release?" Clive asked. "Yes. Coordinate with the communications team, but keep the circle of knowledge as small as possible for now. I want to inform William personally before this becomes public. And..." Charles paused, struggling with his next words. "I want Harry to hear about this from me directly, not from the media." Charles knew that calling Harry would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. They had barely spoken in months, and their last few exchanges had been tense and formal. But, despite everything, Charles felt he owed his son the courtesy of hearing about this decision directly from him. While Clive began the delicate process of preparing for the announcement, Charles walked through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, thinking about all the history these walls had witnessed. Kings and queens had made momentous decisions within these rooms for centuries. Wars had been declared, peace treaties signed, empires built and dismantled. But, for Charles, this personal decision about his son felt as significant as any of those historic moments. He passed portraits of previous monarchs, wondering if any of them had faced similar family crises. His own mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had dealt with various scandals and difficulties involving her children, but nothing quite like the very public departure of a senior royal. Charles felt the weight of setting a precedent that future monarchs might have to follow. The king's thoughts were interrupted by his phone buzzing with a message from William. His eldest son was asking if they could speak privately about the Harry situation. William had been pushing for months for a definitive resolution to Harry's status, arguing that the continued uncertainty was damaging the monarchy's reputation and effectiveness. Charles had mixed feelings about William's stance on Harry. On one hand, he appreciated that William was thinking about the institution and its future. As the next in line for the throne, William had every right to be concerned about anything that might weaken the monarchy. On the other hand, Charles sometimes felt that William was too quick to write off his younger brother, showing little patience for Harry's struggles or attempts to find a different path within royal life. The relationship between the two brothers had been one of the most painful casualties of the Harry and Meghan crisis. Charles had watched his sons grow from close childhood companions to virtual strangers who could barely speak to each other at family gatherings. The boy who had once comforted Harry at their mother's funeral now seemed to view his younger brother as a threat to the institution they both served. Charles called William back immediately, knowing this conversation couldn't wait. "William, I've made the decision about Harry. I'm announcing today that there will be no return to royal duties. It's final." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before William responded. "I think that's the right decision, Papa. It's been impossible to move forward with this uncertainty hanging over everything." "How is Harry being informed?" "I'm going to call him myself before the announcement goes public. He deserves to hear it from me directly." Charles's voice carried a warning that William seemed to understand. "Of course. This can't have been easy for you to decide." William's tone softened slightly, acknowledging his father's pain even as he supported the decision. After ending the call with William, Charles returned to his study to prepare for the most difficult phone call of his reign. He looked at his watch and calculated the time difference with California. It would be early morning there, and Harry would likely be having breakfast with his family. Charles hated the thought of disrupting that peaceful domestic scene with news that would undoubtedly cause pain and anger. But there was no good time to deliver such news, and Charles knew that waiting would only make it worse. He picked up his secure phone and dialed Harry's private number, a number he had called countless times over the years with much happier news to share. The phone rang several times before Harry answered, his voice cautious. "Father? Harry, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I need to speak with you about something important." Charles's formal tone immediately put Harry on alert. "Is everyone all right? Is it about grandmother's estate?" Harry's mind immediately went to practical concerns, unaware that his father was about to deliver news that would change everything between them. "Everyone is well, Harry. This is about your future relationship with the monarchy. I've made a decision that I wanted you to hear directly from me before it becomes public." Charles took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would likely end any hope of reconciliation with his son. "I'm listening." Harry's voice had grown cold, sensing that whatever his father was about to say would not be good news. "After much consideration and consultation with advisors, I've decided to formally announce that there will be no return to royal duties for you and Meghan. Your decision to step back from royal life was final, and the monarchy is moving forward accordingly. You will always be my son, and I will always love you, but your future lies outside the institution." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like minutes. Charles could hear the sounds of family life in the background, children's voices, a television playing, the normal sounds of a California morning. It made the contrast with his formal announcement even more stark. When Harry finally spoke, his voice was barely controlled. "So that's it then? After everything we've been through, after all my years of service, you're just cutting me off completely? No discussion, no negotiation, just a royal decree?" "Harry, we've been discussing this situation for 3 years. Every attempt at finding a middle ground has failed. The uncertainty is damaging both you and the monarchy. This decision provides clarity for everyone." Charles tried to keep his voice steady and reasonable, even as his heart was breaking. "Clarity? You mean punishment. You're punishing me for choosing my wife and children over an institution that never supported us anyway." Harry's anger was building with each word. "That's not how I see it, Harry. You made choices about how you wanted to live your life, and I respect those choices. But those choices have consequences. You can't be partially royal, either you serve the institution fully, or you build a life outside it. You've chosen the latter. And what about my children? What about their inheritance, their connection to their heritage?" Harry's voice cracked slightly, revealing the pain beneath his anger. Charles felt a sharp stab of grief at the mention of his grandchildren. Archie and Lilibet would grow up barely knowing him, and now there would be even less connection to their royal heritage. But Charles forced himself to focus on his duty as king rather than his feelings as a grandfather. "Your children will always be part of this family, Harry. But their path will not be through royal service. They'll have the freedom to choose their own lives without the burden of royal duty." Charles tried to find some comfort in these words, both for Harry and himself. "Freedom? You mean exile. You're making sure they grow up knowing their grandfather chose the institution over them." Harry's words cut deep, but Charles knew he couldn't let emotion override his judgment. "I'm making sure they grow up with a father who chose to put them first, Harry. That's what you wanted, isn't it? The chance to raise your children away from all this?" Charles gestured around his empty study, though Harry couldn't see him. There was another long pause before Harry spoke again, his voice now sounding defeated rather than angry. "When is this being announced?" "This afternoon, London time." "I wanted you to know first, and I'll be informing the rest of the family shortly." Charles felt like each word was physically painful to speak. "I see. Well, thank you for the courtesy of a phone call, I suppose. Though I imagine this decision was made a long time ago." Harry's bitter tone made Charles wince. "Harry, please understand that this brings me no joy. I had hoped we could find another way, But, you couldn't risk the monarchy for one rebellious son.
I understand, father. I understand perfectly.
Harry's use of the formal father instead of his usual papa felt like a door slamming shut. The line went quiet again, and Charles knew the conversation was over. Harry, I want you to know that despite everything, I'm proud of the man you've become and the father you are to your children.
That will never change. Goodbye, father.
The line went dead, leaving Charles holding the phone and listening to the silence. Charles sat back in his chair, feeling older than he ever had before. In the space of one phone call, he had probably ended his relationship with his younger son forever. But he also felt a strange sense of relief. The uncertainty was over. The speculation could finally end. The monarchy could move forward without the constant question of Harry's role hanging over every decision. Outside his window, life continued as normal. Tourists still gathered at the palace gates, staff continued their duties, London carried on with its daily rhythm. In a few hours, the world would know about King Charles's decision regarding Prince Harry. But, right now, in the quiet of his study, Charles allowed himself a moment to grieve for the relationship that might have been and the grandchildren he might never really know. The hardest part was over. Now came the challenge of living with the consequences of his choice, both as a king and as a father. Charles knew that history would judge whether he had made the right decision. But, in this moment, all he felt was the profound sadness of a parent who had run out of options to save his child from the path they had chosen. The official statement was released at exactly 2 p.m. London time, just as the palace communications team had planned. Within minutes, news alerts were pinging on phones around the world, and television broadcasts were being interrupted with breaking news bulletins. King Charles formally ends Prince Harry's royal role scrolled across screens in dozens of languages, marking the end of one of the most watched family dramas of the modern era. In Montecito, California, Harry sat in his garden after receiving the devastating phone call from his father. Meghan had found him there an hour later, staring at his phone with tears streaming down his face. She didn't need to ask what had happened, she could see the heartbreak written across her husband's features. All their hopes for eventual reconciliation, all the quiet dreams of their children knowing their grandfather, had been shattered with a single phone call.
He's done it, Meg. He's actually done it.
Harry's voice was barely above a whisper as Meghan sat beside him on their garden bench.
No more speculation, no more hope. I'm officially out.
Meghan took his hand, feeling her own tears starting to fall. Despite all the pain and conflict of the past few years, she had always hoped that somehow the family could find their way back to each other. She had seen how much Harry missed his father and brother, even though he rarely spoke about it. Now the door had been slammed shut permanently.
I'm so sorry, Harry. I know how much you hoped things could be different.
Meghan's voice carried the weight of her own guilt. She knew that Harry's estrangement from his family had begun with their relationship, and, no matter how much she told herself they had made the right choices, she couldn't help feeling responsible for his pain. Inside their house, 4-year-old Archie was playing with his toys, unaware that his world had just changed forever. 2-year-old Lilibet was napping peacefully, equally oblivious to the fact that her grandfather had just formally rejected any relationship with her. Harry looked toward the house, wondering how he would explain to his children someday why they didn't know their royal relatives.
Harry's phone had been buzzing constantly since the announcement.
Messages from friends, former colleagues, journalists, and charity partners were flooding in. Some offered support and sympathy, others wanted his reaction to his father's decision, and many were simply curious about what this meant for his future.
One message stood out from the rest.
It was from his old friend and military colleague, J.J. Chalmers, who had served with Harry in Afghanistan.
Brother, I know today is tough. Remember that your worth isn't defined by titles or institutions.
You're the same man who saved lives in Helmand and changed countless others through your charity work.
That hasn't changed.
The simple message brought fresh tears to Harry's eyes. His military service had been one of the proudest periods of his life, and his work with wounded veterans had given him a sense of purpose that royal duties had never quite matched. Perhaps JJ was right, perhaps his value as a person wasn't diminished by his father's decision. But, even as Harry tried to find comfort in that thought, he couldn't escape the feeling of profound rejection.
This wasn't just about losing royal titles or ceremonial roles. This was his father telling the world that Harry no longer had a place in the family that had defined his entire identity for 39 years. Across the Atlantic, the British public was reacting with a mixture of sadness, relief, and anger. Opinion polls had consistently shown the country divided about Harry and Meghan, with roughly equal numbers supporting and opposing their decision to leave royal life. Now that division was playing out in real time across social media and in heated conversations in pubs, offices, and family homes across the United Kingdom. Sarah Miller, a retired teacher from Manchester, spoke for many when she told a television news crew, "It's heartbreaking to see a family torn apart like this, but Harry made his choice when he left. You can't have it both ways, either you're royal or you're not." But others saw the King's announcement as unnecessarily harsh. James Thompson, a university student from Edinburgh, argued, "Charles is putting the institution before his own son. What kind of father does that? Harry served his country with honor, and now he's being cast aside because he wanted to protect his family." The media response was immediate and intense. Newspapers that had supported Harry and Meghan denounced the King's decision as cold and vindictive. Publications that had criticized the couple praised Charles for finally providing clarity and protecting the monarchy's reputation. International media outlets analyzed the decision through the lens of their own cultural perspectives on family, duty, and institutional loyalty. Television networks cleared their schedules to provide wall-to-wall coverage of the announcement and its implications. Royal experts, constitutional scholars, and former palace officials were rushed into studios to provide analysis and commentary. Many noted that this was the first time in modern history that a monarch had so definitively excluded a close family member from any future royal role. In Kensington Palace, Prince William was dealing with his own complex emotions about his father's announcement. As the heir to the throne, he had supported the decision as necessary for the monarchy's future. But, as Harry's older brother, he felt a deep sadness about how completely their relationship had broken down. William remembered teaching Harry to ride a bike in the gardens of Kensington Palace when they were children. He thought about how Harry had been his closest companion during the dark days after their mother's death, how they had supported each other through the awkward teenage years under constant media scrutiny. All of that seemed like a lifetime ago now. Catherine, William's wife, had tried multiple times over the years to mediate between the brothers. She had genuinely liked Meghan initially and had hoped they could all find a way to work together. But the gulf between the two families had proven too wide to bridge, and Catherine had watched helplessly as her husband grieved the loss of his relationship with Harry. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Catherine asked William as they watched the news coverage together that evening. William considered the question carefully before responding. "I don't know. Harry's made it clear that he sees us as the enemy now. And, after today, I'm not sure there's any way back." The reaction from Commonwealth countries was particularly interesting to palace officials. Nations like Australia, Canada, and New Zealand had maintained strong support for Harry throughout the crisis, seeing him as a more modern and relatable face of the royal family. The formal announcement that he would never return to royal duties was met with disappointment in many of these countries. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese issued a diplomatic statement saying, "Prince Harry will always be welcome in Australia, where he has many friends and supporters who admire his service to veterans and his commitment to important causes." Similar messages came from other Commonwealth leaders, subtly indicating that Harry retained significant international support despite his estrangement from the British royal family. Palace officials worried that this could complicate future royal tours and diplomatic relationships. In the charity sector, the reaction was mixed. Organizations that had worked closely with Harry expressed sadness at the formal end of his royal role while emphasizing their continued support for his work. The Invictus Games, Harry's signature charitable project, issued a statement affirming that his leadership of the organization would continue regardless of his royal status. But other charities that had hoped to work with Harry in some official capacity expressed disappointment. The formal announcement made it clear that any future charitable work would be entirely separate from the monarchy, potentially limiting the impact and fundraising ability of Harry's efforts. Social media exploded with reactions from around the world. #KingCharles and #Prince Harry quickly became trending topics globally,
with millions of people sharing their opinions about the royal family drama. The response was sharply divided along generational, cultural, and political lines. Younger users generally expressed support for Harry, seeing him as someone who had prioritized his mental health and family well-being over institutional expectations. Older users were more likely to support Charles, viewing the king's decision as necessary to maintain royal dignity and tradition. International users often saw the situation through the lens of their own country's relationship with monarchy and tradition. Americans generally supported Harry's choice to prioritize individual freedom over institutional duty, while users from other monarchies were more sympathetic to Charles's position as head of state. Celebrity reactions were swift and often emotional. Oprah Winfrey, who had conducted the explosive interview with Harry and Meghan, posted a message of support, wishing Prince Harry and his beautiful family peace and happiness as they continue their journey of service and love. Other celebrities who had worked with Harry on various causes expressed similar sentiments, emphasizing his personal qualities and charitable work rather than his royal status. The entertainment industry, particularly in America, seemed to close ranks around Harry and Meghan in the wake of the announcement. As evening fell in London, King Charles was briefed on the global reaction to his announcement. The response had been intense but not unexpected. Palace officials reported that the decision was being generally well received in Britain, with many people expressing relief that the uncertainty was finally over. But Charles found little comfort in these reports. Standing in the same study where he had written the letter that morning, he felt the full weight of what he had done. He had chosen the monarchy over his relationship with his younger son, and that choice would define the rest of his reign. The king's private phone had been silent all afternoon. No calls from Harry, no messages from California. Charles hadn't expected any, but the silence still felt deafening. He wondered if he would ever speak to his son again, if his grandchildren would grow up knowing him only as a distant figure from news reports. Queen Camilla found Charles in his study late that evening, still staring out the window at the palace gardens. She had supported his decision throughout the difficult process, but she could see the toll it had taken on her husband. "You did what you had to do, Charles. History will understand that you were protecting the institution for William and George and future generations." Camilla's words were meant to comfort, but Charles knew that history's judgment was far less important to him than his own conscience. "I hope Harry can find happiness in America, away from all this," Charles said quietly. "I hope someday he can forgive me for choosing duty over our relationship." As the night deepened and the initial media frenzy began to settle into longer-term analysis, both father and son were left to contemplate a future without each other. In California, Harry held his sleeping daughter and wondered how to explain to her that she would never know her grandfather's love. In London, Charles looked at photos of his grandchildren and wondered if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. The announcement had been made, the world had reacted, and the future was set. King Charles III had sent his clear signal about Prince Harry's place in the monarchy: there would be no place at all. The royal family would continue their duties and traditions, but they would do so without Harry. For a family that had once seemed unbreakable despite their problems, this felt like the final chapter in a tragedy that no one had wanted to write. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for both men as they learned to live with the consequences of this day. The monarchy would adapt and move forward, and Harry would continue building his life in America. But neither man would ever be quite the same after the day when duty and love collided so completely that only one could survive. The story of King Charles and Prince Harry had reached its conclusion, not with reconciliation or understanding, but with the painful acceptance that some relationships cannot be repaired, even between a father and son who had once loved each other without question. The crown had won, but the cost had been higher than anyone could have imagined.